overhead analysis sheet or OAS. So beside me here is the overhead analysis sheet for airmax per height. In the table, it consists of the overhead, the total overhead, the basis of rapprochement, the production cost center, and the service cost center. As for production cost center, it consists of assembly, machining, and finishing, while for service cost center, it consists of store and canteen only. As for the overhead and the total overhead, it was already given in the questions. So we just need to put it on the table and determine the suitable basis for each overhead. As for indirect labors and indirect materials, the basis or rapprochements are direct allocation as the total were already being given in the question. So we just need to state in the table. While for the others overheads, we need to determine the suitable basis or rapprochement. Beside the indirect materials and the indirect labors, we need to calculate each overhead so that we can determine the total overhead for the 5 departments, which is assembly, machining, finishing, canteen, and store. After that, we do another rapprochements by using the total overhead from canteen and store to determine the exact total overhead for assembly, machining, and finishing. Overhead absorption rate. So, for assembly and machining, it used the machine hours as for the basis, while finishing used direct labor hours for the basis. So, in order to get the total overhead absorption rate, the calculation need to use the total overhead after the rapprochements divided by the direct labor hours or machine hours that were already given in the questions or already stated in the question. Last but not least, it is to determine whether the overhead is under-absorbed or over-absorbed. So to calculate, we use the overhead absorption rate multiplied by the direct labor hours or machine hours that were already given in the questions. Thus, as for the assembly, it is under-absorbed, while machining is over-absorbed, and lastly, finishing is under-absorbed.
Next, I will explain how to answer question 2. For question 2a, the question asks to find the overhead cost per unit for each pipe using traditional absorption costing. The formula is OAR equal to total OH divided total basic unit. So the answer for OAR is RM28.30 per direct labor hour. So to find OH cost per unit is RM28.30 multiply with direct labor hours for each pipe. And the answer is based on the screen. For question 2b, the question asks to find overhead cost per unit for each product using activity-based costing. First, find the cost driver for each activity. For this question, they provide 4 activity, which is machine setup cost, and the cost driver is number of production. Machine running cost, the cost driver is machine hours. Procurement cost, the cost driver is number of purchase order, and the last activity is delivery cost, and the cost driver is number of delivery. After know the cost driver, find the cost driver rate. The overhead cost for each activity has been given. So to know the total of cost driver is overhead cost multiplied with the cost driver for all 3 products. After know the total of cost driver rate, to find overhead cost per unit is add all the overhead costs and divide with the total unit of product produced for each pipe or for each product.
Implementation problems often experienced with ABC system. The first problem is data processing and collection take a little time. So for this explanation, team members of the company must manually calculate the cost of each product rather than totaling the cost and dividing the amount all items. Second, to collect correct information and extra resources could be needed. Data collection for specific items can be moment and pricey. Payroll issues may arise from hiring or allocating members of the team for the operation, and company could also need to buy data collection tools. Third, could be at contrast with management quality standards that were previously established using traditional costing system. Could be contrast with the management quality standard because a business system require the management calculate the cost of activity pools as well as define and quantity the cost drivers that will serve as the foundation for cost allocation. Fourth, disadvantages for a smaller company. This is because ABC is more beneficial to bigger industrial companies than to smaller companies, and its effectiveness varies depending on the organization. A company that uses cost plus pricing may also benefit from ABC because it provides realistic product costs.
Briefly explains the following term. The first one is the cost allocations. The acts of recognizing, aggregating, and allocating expenses to cost objects such as departments, or products, programs, or a company branch is known as cost allocations. It does mean that we need to reapportionate all the cost objects in a few departments, such as products and a program, to entails identifying of cost object in a corporations, determining the expenses incurred by the cost objects, and then allocating the cost to the cost object based on certain criteria. The second one is the cost apportionment. When cost item cannot be correctly allocated to object certain cost center, they are prorated across several cost objects on an equal basis. This is referred to as cost apportionment. Is the proportional allocations of a various cost item to the cost units or the cost center on a proper basis. The allocations of a various overhead items to the department in proportions on a logical basis is referred to as a cost apportionment. The third one is the overhead absorption rate. The quantities of indirect costs described to cost item is referred to as overhead absorptions, and overhead absorptions is only required for external financial reporting, not for internal management reporting. Selling and marketing expenses and administrative costs and manufacturing costs are examples of indirect costs.
For differences of traditional costing and activity-based costing or ABC, we can conclude that we have 5 differences between both of them. Firstly, traditional costing is more simplistic and cheap compared to activity-based costing, which is way more complex and costly to implement. Next, overhead costs for traditional costing are allocated to several productions and services cost centers. Meanwhile, overhead costs for activity-based costing are allocated to activities labeled as cost pools. Thirdly, overhead absorption rates for traditional costing are usually volume-based and for financial, while for activity-based costing are non-financial. Fourth, an overhead rate for traditional costing based on common basis of absorption is calculated to reach at one total of overhead charge, but for ABC, cost drivers or activities are practiced to calculate the cost of the objects. Last but not least, the cost behavior for traditional costing is not presented as the overhead costs are simply linked to the cost centers. Meanwhile, the cost behavior for activity-based costing is presented and more realistic due to the overhead costs are linked with the cost drivers.